Our next speaker is Dr. Miri Weingarten. Miri worked for Physicians for Human Rights, PHR Israel, for 13 years. She moved to London in 2009 and she's led European Union and United Nations advocacy work of PHR Israel and a coalition of Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. She wrote the Israel chapter of MEDAC's 2011 report, Preventing Torture, and she's been engaged in advocacy for the adoption of its conclusions with the UN Special Rapporteur mission to Gaza following Israel's 2008-2009 military offensive. Please give a warm welcome to Miri Weingarten.
Sorry, just a second. Okay, hello. Thank you for being here today. I'm actually trying to recover from the previous presentation, which was very moving, because you talk about militarism in this country, but I grew up in another country, which I prefer to call Israel-Palestine, but which the state I grew up in did not call Israel-Palestine, and in which militarism is the definition of existence. So all that you said I very much support, and that journey from those, as it were, self-evident beliefs is a difficult one. It's not easy to step outside it, and something has to happen in order for that moment to come in which you step outside the ideology you grew up in. And I think every person that has been through that journey has a different experience of why and how exactly that moment came. I think that's maybe crucial to discuss and to think about as well. But today I'm here to talk about Gaza. Unfortunately, I've been in similar fora over the years. In fact, the current chair of this particular one knows me from other such presentations. And each time I talk about a different attack on Gaza or on the West Bank or on both. And while I'm talking now about an attack on Gaza in the middle of last year, the current attacks on the West Bank and on Gaza and also within Israel itself are ongoing. And it's quite a depressing experience, this cyclical and ever worsening spiral. Because what is being addressed is on the surface and not at the root. And perhaps I'll come to that later. Last year, when the attack was ongoing, it was pretty clear to our organization that, like in 2008, 2009, also in 2014, there would be the issue afterwards of accountability, because during the attacks, we were powerless to stop it. Those with the power to stop it did not have the political will, and those with the political will did not have the power. And in such a situation, historically, the struggle for accountability becomes the only hope. If you look at the political situation today, in which no change in the imbalance of power is foreseen, and no accountability is for the perpetrators can be hoped for, all we can do, as far as I can see, apart from the long struggle, is to speak truth, to gather evidence, to say it, so that in the future, when the day comes for justice, there will be the witnesses, those who still live. And so during the attacks, we recruited, I hope that this works now, I'll try. During the attacks, we sent out a call, an international call, including via MedAct, for experts. Experts in forensic pathology, experts in global health, human rights, public health, pediatrics, people who would be able to look at all levels of what was happening, from the level of injury now to the level of long-term impact on the environment of Gaza, which would not enable Gaza to be a safe space to live in the future. The urgency of this mission, the reason we did it during the attack, was because we thought we would have to collect evidence while it was still relatively undisturbed and the events were still fresh in the minds of the victims and survivors. And this sense that we had of urgency was later borne out because, in fact, following the ceasefire, the final ceasefire, Israel did not allow access to Gaza to anyone, neither to the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, nor to Amnesty International, nor to Human Rights Watch, nor to any other investigative external body. And so our fear was that it would remain the Palestinian victims and their fantastic human rights organizations speaking out, and Israel questioning, and the world questioning the credibility of those testimonies. And so for us it was crucial to try to get international medical professionals into the Gaza Strip to come out and to bear testimony. To this end, we got 8 independent international medical experts. Some of them had worked in Palestine before, others had never been in the region before. Our aim was to find people whose credibility was not in question in any way. They entered the Gaza Strip in what we thought was a ceasefire, first in the 19th of August, but the following day, after their arrival in Gaza, the attacks restarted. We thought we were going to get them out of Gaza immediately, but they insisted on staying until the following day. And so the first mission was very short. The second mission was after the ceasefire that did remain, that did sort of sustain itself for a while. That was the 26th of August, when the ceasefire happened. It was never agreed, but it happened. And so the second team went in on September the 8th. And then there was a final entry into Gaza in November to collect information. The organizations that participated in this were from the Israeli side, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and within Gaza, 3 Palestinian human rights health organizations, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights in Gaza. And in fact, all of the information that we have was either from telephone calls from people in Gaza who were being attacked or through those organizations. In addition, because these were medical professionals, there was a possibility to visit those people who had been injured in Gaza and had been referred out of Gaza for medical care. That was a relatively small group of people this time, because it was very hard to get out of Gaza, either into Israel, West Bank, Jordan, or into Egypt. But the team did hold visits to hospitals in East Jerusalem, in which injured people were hospitalized, also a hospital in Amman in Jordan, and in West Bank hospitals, West Bank Palestinian hospitals. Associated doctors also visited hospitals in Egypt. And so as a result of that, we have 68 interviews, basically patient interviews. And we never knew that these interviews were going to be crucial in evidence. But in fact, we discovered that we had been the only team to manage to enter Gaza. The reason being that we had described the mission as a medical mission. And so it took them a little while to realize what the word forensic pathologist means. Because of that, in the final report, in fact, the main part of this sort of big book is the testimonies themselves. And so if you ever get to read the report, I suggest that you skip all the analysis and just go to Annex 1, which is Annex 1, which is basically the interviews with the patients, and each of those interviews is a story in and of itself. We constructed a questionnaire which was not only about the medical condition of the patients, but about the circumstances of their attack, of their injury, about the evacuation, about the problems. And then it was possible to analyze those 68 interviews to get some sort of statistics based on the more serious injuries of how most people came to be injured. I'm not going to go in any detail into our findings. I think that the findings became fairly well known after the publication of the United Nations Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry on the 25th of June. I think it was the 24th of June, which relied heavily on both the Palestinian NGOs and on this report, as well as on some long-distance work done by Amnesty International. The results of that report were then passed on to the International Criminal Court, as was in fact this report. You may not know, but the International Criminal Court has opened a preliminary investigation into human rights violations in Palestine. This happened on the 16th of the 1st, 2015. There is no specific time period that is specified for a preliminary investigation, so we don't really know when the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court will be publishing findings. But one of the key things that they're looking at is the events of this particular attack in 2014. I do want to show you this graph. So this graph is based only on our 68 patients. And the way we chose those 68 patients was solely on the fact of them being hospitalized in the hospitals that we reached. And you know, the criteria for sending someone to one of those hospitals was that the injury was serious enough for people to go through the hell of trying to get a referral out of Gaza into an external hospital. So they were quite serious injuries. But of these 68 patients, 49% had been injured at home. And another 15% had been injured in the home of a relative or a neighbor. And then a much, much smaller percent in our interviews, but in fact there were others, were injured in a UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, shelter. So, you know, the majority of the Gaza population are already refugees from the time of 1948. UNRWA is the agency that takes care of them, and the shelters that people escaped to when their homes were not safe were attacked. Then another significant percentage was injured while evacuating other people. We also interviewed a woman who was injured inside hospital, a nurse. And other people were injured outside in the street, just outside home. 2 people we interviewed were injured while carrying weapons. 2. They never hid the fact that they were carrying weapons when they talked to us. They were targeted on a motorbike, both of them, on the same motorbike. And then there is another percentage which was very low at the time that we were talking to these people, but in fact probably grew later, which was the issue of hazardous sites, because 18,000 housing units, home units, were either destroyed or almost completely destroyed in the course of this attack. But people had nowhere else to go to after the ceasefire, and they went back to the damaged sites of their former homes. Our team, when they visited the morgue in Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, they saw a very small body wrapped up in a shroud or a sheet, and asked the manager of the morgue what had been the story of this particular very small 2.5-year-old child. And the person they talked to said that this was a child who had gone back home after the ceasefire and was standing at the top of the steps and fell down, and a piece of metal fell on her head, and she was killed. So the ongoing impacts were very, very clear to see, also to the teams who went in after the ceasefire. What we concluded, and this is something that has been concluded more broadly already, is that the nature of these attacks were not so much, in the main parts that we were seeing, were not so much what was described before by Ben, of soldiers going in, eye-to-eye contact, and killing. Instead, what you had was death from the air, death from the sea, from drones, from helicopter gunships, from airplanes, from basically killing machines that do not then have the possibility of being injured in themselves. You can stand at a remote control console very far away and press a button and cause destruction to families and people. And this was what characterized the attacks. There were then also additional attacks in which forces went in and engaged in combat, either with Palestinian fighters or with Palestinian civilians. And in those cases, there were also very serious violations. But I think it's very important to think about and to discuss this issue, that soldiers with PTSD because of seeing the child that they killed is one thing, but a soldier who, like the Israeli Air Force commander said, feels just a small jerk to his wing after dropping a bomb on a civilian population, this is a new sort of soldier. It's a soldier that might be able to avoid those nightmares and then also avoid that change, that possible change that Ben was hoping for. I think my time is quite short, isn't it? And I want to talk a little about responsibilities of health workers. But with regard to warnings, the Israeli version was, leaflets were dropped, telephone calls were made, small bombs harmless bombs were used in order to knock on the roof of people that we wanted to get out of the house before we destroyed the houses of terrorists and so on and so forth. But it's very sort of informative to discover that very few of the people that we interviewed who were injured had actually received any kind of warning. And in addition, what we were told by the evacuation services, the Palestine Red Crescent Society, was that basically there were whole areas that were told to evacuate. And Gaza is this tiny, tiny coastal strip. So people from the north were told to evacuate southward, and then people from the south were told to evacuate northward. And people from the east, that's the border with Israel, were told to evacuate towards the sea. And from the sea, there were also attacks. So in the end, there was this tiny, narrow strip in the center to which people were forced. And there were bombardments. And so in fact, and in effect, and in the end, this is what we call the report, there was no safe place. One of the specific sort of conclusions we reached was with regard to double tap. You might have heard of it in different contexts. But basically, this is a bit of a testimony from one of the patient testimonies. The mother went out of the house with her children. She was walking down the street. There was a missile in front of them. It was probably from a drone. And people got injured, and there was some screaming and a mess. And the mother went to check on one of the boys who had fallen. Other family members rushed to the scene to see what was happening. And almost immediately, within 5 minutes of the first attack, a second missile fell. And then all the people who had come to rescue, the first people who had been injured, were killed or injured. And this seems also to have characterized the attacks. We were told again and again by ambulance drivers, by other people who were evacuated, that it was an extremely dangerous situation because coordination of evacuation was not possible. They would wait and wait and wait for evacuation for coordination with the authorities via the Red Cross, and this would not come, so they would go out without coordination to the site of an attack, and then the site would be attacked again, and sometimes again. There is in fact one video footage that we also appended to the report in which 11 attacks in succession, artillery shells fall while ambulances are evacuating. Okay. I think trouble here. Yes. Again, attacks on medical personnel, this is nothing new for the Israeli-Palestine context. I won't read it out. Let you do that. It's another aspect of the issue of health and conflict, isn't it? Health workers on the front line. There's another session on this issue here. The Israeli military, again, we were told by all hospital staff we spoke to, they were at the beginning of the attacks, but also before the attacks, prior to the attacks. They had the exact coordinates of every single hospital and medical facility in the Gaza Strip. And nonetheless, hospitals were targeted. Well, I use the word targeted with caution, but that's our conclusion. Shuhada al-Aqsa Hospital was attacked. A nurse, a wonderful, brave nurse called Iman, was interviewed in Jordan while she was recovering from a very, very bad injury, and described how the missile hit the wards and how, again, this was attacks in quick succession, not once, but many times. How long do I have? A few minutes, okay. Okay, yes. I think there were several areas in which there were particular serious attacks. One of them was Shujaiya, and that became famous with regard to attacks in the marketplace on the 20th and on the 30th of July. Another was Rafah, where the so-called Hannibal procedure was used after the death of an Israeli soldier. There was after the assumed kidnap of an Israeli soldier. There was a huge attack in Rafah, and a conception that it would be preferable for the soldier to be dead than to be kidnapped in order for him not to be used as a hostage. But we chose an area called Khuza'a because we spoke to a woman who told us a most terrible story, and we decided to go to that particular place, which was the site of attacks on the 21st to the 25th of July. So it starts with leaflets being thrown and saying population should leave. Khuza'a is very close to the border with Israel, and so people move westwards towards Khan Yunis, which is the nearest town. After a few days when nothing happens, some people move back. Other people suffer attacks in Khan Yunis, and so they come back to Khuza'a because they think it's safer. Then the access routes are all bombed, so there is no way in or out of the town. And basically the area is closed, and there is no access to ICRC ambulances or escorts. On the 23rd of July, people who've been sheltering in basements or in places that they thought were safe gathered together in homes of neighbors or of relatives. They decide to go together en masse with white flags. It's about 1,000 to 1,300 people. They carry white plastic bags, white sheets, white pieces of paper, anything that looks like a white flag, and they move out en masse. And as they move out, they get shot. They get shouted at by megaphones, and they are shot at by snipers, and there's shelling in the area, and there seems to be shooting from tanks, not shooting by the main barrel of the tank, but by machine guns from the tanks. There are several injuries, and people basically escape to a private clinic nearby. We interviewed the doctor in the clinic. Several hundred people are sheltering in the clinic when it's also hit by missiles and causes more injuries and deaths. And then about 1,000 people escape from the clinic and its environs into a basement of a next-door house. Then the basement is attacked, both tear gas and afterwards the house on top of the basement, which partly collapses, and people are forced to leave again. Finally, on the 24th of July, more than 24 hours after the first attempt, this big group is allowed to leave without being shot at. They go all the way around the fields and arrive in a center full of tanks and ambulances, and from there they get evacuated. And of course, some people die in the process. In particular, one 6-year-old boy was captured on video, and all the people we spoke to from Khuza'a referred to him again and again because he had a very, very severe injury. People described it as he was carrying his intestines in his hands, begging to be evacuated, within eye contact of the soldiers and not allowed to reach an ambulance in time. This boy died. In addition, we hear stories of human shields, basements in which soldiers come in, pick up men, blindfold them, take them to windows of the houses, and then shoot from behind them over their shoulders in order to protect themselves as soldiers, because there are Palestinian fighters inside the village, or at least they fear that there are. This goes on for hours, for 8 hours. For us, Khuza'a epitomizes the attacks. because you have mass destruction by indiscriminate weapons at first, which cause injuries, death, destruction of homes. Then you have denial of evacuation and attacks on medical evacuation and on medical protection. And finally, you have the face-to-face responsibility type of violation, the type that Ben was talking about, where men are abused or where children are left to die. And so for us, the responsibility and the accountability goes from top to bottom. Israeli investigation mechanisms only enable investigation within the army of individual soldiers, the lower ranks. They don't enable investigation of Israeli army policy, and they don't enable investigation of those people who approved policies within the army, and they definitely don't enable investigation of the political decision makers, the government, who enabled it all to happen. Such indiscriminate attacks can't be made by decision of a single soldier. And so there are not the investigation mechanisms locally to enable accountability, and that's pretty clear to us. And this is why this information has been passed on to the International Criminal Court. This is why the United Nations Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry recommended that universal jurisdiction be employed. That is, that there should be a possibility of extradition of possible culprits to justice overseas, because there is none available locally. I think that the role of medical teams in all of this is crucial, because in this case, as bearing witness, I'll stop. In this case, as bearing witness, in a place and in a story in which the fight for what actually happened is so heavily ideologized, it's medical teams that are able to speak with credibility and to provide this accountability, if not for the present, but for the future.